No nurse lasted a week with him. Not the first one, not the 10th one, not the 27th one. They all came with their crisp white uniforms and their professional smiles in their careful hands. And they all left before the week was out, some in tears, some in fury, one reportedly in the middle of the night, without even collecting her final paycheck. Ethan Blackwood had that effect on people. He had, in fact, perfected the art of driving them away, and if there was a single thing he took pride in during those 2 hollow years after the accident, it was the completeness of that record. 27 nurses, 0 survivors. The agency had stopped sending the hopeful ones, the ones who arrived with cheerful determination and laminated credentials, and told his household manager they were certain they could handle anything. Those ones left the fastest. They had been replaced, over time, by the more stoic variety experienced, seasoned professionals who arrived without visible expectations and lasted slightly longer, but ended, inevitably, in the same place. Gerald, his chief of staff, had begun keeping a spreadsheet. He had stopped showing it to Ethan after the 15th dismissal, on the grounds that Ethan did not need any additional reinforcement of the view that other human beings were, as a category, optional. And now, on a gray Tuesday morning in October, a chubby woman in pale blue scrubs was walking up the front steps of his estate carrying a tin of homemade cookies, smiling at his security guards like they were old friends and Ethan Blackwood, watching from the second-floor window with the flat gray eyes of a man who had decided the world held no more surprises, felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt in a very long time. He told himself it was irritation. He was wrong. The Blackwood estate sat on 40 acres of manicured land in the rolling hills north of New York City, the kind of property that made real estate agents lower their voices when they described it. The main house had 14 bedrooms, a private medical suite, a heated indoor pool, a library that held more than 8,000 volumes, and a security system that cost more annually to maintain than most families earned in a lifetime. The iron gates at the entrance bore no name, no number, no indication of who lived behind them. Ethan preferred it that way. He had spent the last 2 years learning to prefer a great many things he had never wanted: silence, stillness, the particular quality of afternoon light that fell through the tall windows of his study when there was no one around to interrupt it. He had not chosen this life. It had been chosen for him on a rainy Thursday evening 14 months ago, when the private helicopter carrying him from a conference in Boston had gone down over the Hudson Valley and left him with a spinal contusion that his team of neurologists described, in careful clinical language, as severe, but potentially reversible. Potentially. That word had come to define the boundaries of his existence. Mrs. Eleanor Marsh, who had managed the Blackwood household for 11 years, and who possessed, as a result, both an encyclopedic knowledge of the estate's operations and a spine made of something stronger than most people's wills, briefed new staff with the precision of a military commander delivering a battlefield assessment. She did so now in the marble-floored entrance hall, her gray hair pinned immaculately, her expression conveying neither warmth nor hostility, but a kind of seasoned neutrality that said, "I have seen everything this house can produce, and I am still standing." She had refined this briefing over 27 iterations refined it. Actually, in the way that any document gets refined by repeated exposure to the catastrophic failure modes it is designed to prevent. Early versions had been softer, more explanatory, more generous in their invitations to ask questions. Those versions had produced nurses who thought they understood more than they did, and who had therefore lasted, on average, 2 days before discovering their mistake. The current version was precise to the point of severity, and Mrs. Marsh delivered it without apology. The rules, she explained, were not suggestions. Mr. Blackwood did not tolerate personal conversation. He did not tolerate questions about his late wife, about his finances, about his companies, about his accident, or about the timeline of his recovery. He did not tolerate changes to his daily schedule without written notice submitted 48 hours in advance. He did not tolerate noise after 9 in the evening or before 7 in the morning. He did not tolerate visitors entering rooms they had not been explicitly authorized to enter. He did not tolerate unsolicited physical contact of any kind. He did not, Mrs. Marsh concluded with the slight pause of someone who had rehearsed this line many times. Tolerate weakness. He has dismissed 27 nurses, she said. You are the 28th. The young woman standing across from her, Hannah Brooks, according to the agency file, 31 years old, licensed registered nurse, 5 years of experience in rehabilitation medicine, nodded slowly, looked around the entrance hall, and said, That's a beautiful chandelier. Mrs. Marsh blinked. In 11 years, no one had ever commented on the chandelier. Ethan heard her before he saw her. He heard the way she said good morning to Daniel, the security guard who stood at the bottom of the staircase. And he heard Daniel's silent, granite-faced Daniel, who had not spoken more than 12 words in a single conversation in the 3 years he had worked there, actually laugh. He heard the sound of her footsteps, light and unhurried, coming up the stairs. He heard her pause on the landing. And then Hannah Brooks walked through the door of his suite, and the first thing she did was look directly at him, not at his wheelchair, not at his legs, not at the medical equipment arranged with clinical precision along the wall, but at him, at his face, with eyes that were brown and bright and entirely unafraid. And she smiled the way people smile when they are genuinely, uncalculatingly glad to see someone. Mr. Blackwood, she said. I'm Hannah. I'll be taking care of you. He stared at her. She was round-faced and rosy-cheeked, and she had brought, he now noticed, a blue tin tucked under one arm. I made oatmeal cookies this morning, she added, setting the tin on the table beside the door. For the staff. Well, and for you, if you want one. I don't eat food from strangers, he said. His voice came out flat and final. The voice he used for closing conversations. Hannah considered this for exactly 1 second. Okay, she said, and opened the tin and took out a cookie and ate it herself, standing there in the middle of his suite, looking perfectly comfortable. The silence that followed was the loudest silence Ethan had heard in years. He found he had absolutely nothing to say. She broke 3 rules before noon. The first was the cookie, which technically fell under the clause about unsolicited personal engagement. The second was the window. She crossed the room without asking permission and pushed open the tall casement window that looked out over the south garden, and a wash of cold October air came in carrying the smell of wet leaves and grass, and Ethan breathed it in despite himself. It's stuffy in here, she said, by way of explanation, in a tone that suggested stuffiness was a medical condition she had diagnosed and was now treating. The third rule was the curtain. The heavy blackout curtains that he kept drawn over the east-facing windows because the morning light, when it came in at a certain angle, fell across the framed photograph on his desk in a way that he could not bear to see. She pulled back with one decisive motion, and the room filled with gray October light, and Ethan gripped the armrests of his wheelchair and said, very quietly, You were told not to touch things in this room. Hannah turned. She looked at him steadily. I was told not to touch things without permission, she said. I should have asked. I'm sorry. It was such a simple thing. Such a plain, unadorned apology, with no performance of guilt and no elaborate justification, that Ethan felt something shift in the architecture of his composure, some small structural adjustment he could not immediately account for. He said nothing. Hannah turned back to the window and looked out at the garden. The roses are still going, she said. In October, that's unusual. He didn't answer, but he looked. That night, for the first time in 4 months, he slept for almost 2 hours before the pain woke him. Hannah had worked with difficult patients before. She had worked with a retired general who had thrown a bedpan at her on her 3rd day and later cried when she held his hand during a procedure. She had worked with a corporate attorney who had threatened to sue the hospital for every conceivable violation he could invent, and who had asked her to be a witness at his daughter's wedding 8 months after discharge. She had worked with an elderly woman who screamed biblical curses at the nursing staff every morning, and then, every afternoon, asked Hannah to read poetry to her. She had grown up in a small apartment in South Baltimore, with a mother who worked 2 jobs and a younger brother who needed more than the family had, and she had learned early before nursing school, Before any of it, that the people who seemed hardest to reach were often simply the people who had been let down the most times and had decided to preempt the next disappointment by making themselves too difficult to bother with. She had never had the luxury of being frightened by difficult people, because frightened was something you couldn't afford to be when you needed every job, every shift, every paycheck. That history had given her something that couldn't be taught in a classroom. She understood something that many people, including many experienced nurses, did not fully understand, that anger is almost never about what it appears to be about. The man who throws the bedpan is not angry about the bedpan. The man who invents lawsuits is not angry about the hospital. And Ethan Blackwood, with his 27 dismissed nurses and his ironclad rules and his silences that pressed against the walls of his rooms like something physical, was not angry about the cookies or the curtain or the window. She had known this within the first 10 minutes. What she needed to understand was what, exactly, he was angry about instead. She began the way she always began, by watching. She watched the way he held himself in the wheelchair, straight-backed, controlled. The posture of a man refusing to allow the chair to define him. She watched the way his assistant spoke to him, in careful, modulated tones, as though he were a substance that might combust under the wrong conditions. She watched the way he looked at his legs, sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, not with despair, exactly, but with something colder than despair, something that looked almost like contempt, as though his own body had become an adversary he was refusing to forgive. She read his medical file with the attention she might have given a complex legal document, making notes in the small spiral notebook she carried everywhere. And then she spoke with his neurologist, Dr. Patricia Voss, who told her that the nerve damage was significant, but that the pathways were not destroyed, that with the right rehabilitation protocol, applied with sufficient consistency, there was a real possibility of substantial recovery. The problem, Dr. Voss said, was that every previous attempt at consistent rehabilitation had been interrupted by Ethan himself, who had fired or intimidated away every professional attempting to help him. He's sabotaging his own recovery, Dr. Voss said, and there was a careful frustration in her voice. The frustration of someone watching something preventable happen anyway. Hannah nodded. She had already suspected as much. She had also already decided what she was going to do about it. On the third day, she told him to pick up his own water glass. He looked at her as though she had suggested he take up skydiving. There is a staff member here for that purpose, he said. There is a staff member here for a lot of purposes, Hannah said. But your hand works fine. Reach it. The silence that followed had a particular quality, the silence of a man recalibrating, deciding which way the confrontation was going to go. He had dismissed nurses for less than this. He had dismissed nurses for smiling at the wrong moment, for adjusting the pillow without asking, for making a mild observation about the weather in a tone he had judged insufficiently professional. He was aware of all of this. He was also aware, in the part of himself that was too clear-eyed for its own comfort, that none of those nurses had said anything particularly wrong. He had dismissed them because dismissal was available to him, because it gave him the sensation of control, and because in the long wreckage of the months following Claire's death and then the accident, control, even the petty, purposeless kind, had been the only thing that felt solid under his feet. He looked at the water glass. He looked at Hannah, who was watching him with the expression of someone who has offered a reasonable thing and is simply waiting to see if it gets accepted. Ethan Blackwood reached out and picked up the glass. He drank from it. He set it down. He looked at Hannah with something that was not quite anger and not quite amusement. And it occurred to her that he might not have a word for what he was feeling, which meant it was probably something he hadn't felt before. That, she said, is where we start. She had him doing 30 minutes of hand and arm exercises by the end of the week, and upper body resistance work by the end of the second week, and by the middle of the third week when she finally, carefully, in the presence of Dr. Voss and with every safety measure in place, had him attempt to bear weight on his legs for the first time in months. The look on his face when his feet pressed against the floor and held, for 4 seconds, 5 seconds, 6. That look was something Hannah knew she was going to carry with her for a very long time. Dr. Voss, standing behind him, pressed her hand briefly to her mouth. No one spoke. 6 seconds of standing, after 400 and some days of not standing. 6 seconds that felt like something ancient and enormous had shifted beneath the surface of the world. The discovery happened on a Wednesday. Hannah had been looking for the linen closet, a reasonable activity, she felt, for someone in charge of a patient's daily comfort, and had opened what she thought was a closet door, and found instead a room. It was a large room, windowless, fitted with screens that covered 3 walls, and hummed with the constant soft activity of real-time data feeds, financial markets, corporate communication systems, operational dashboards, for what appeared to be several dozen separate business entities. There were names on the screens she recognized: Blackwood Capital, Meridian Health Systems, 3 more she couldn't place, and numbers that moved in ways that suggested quantities far beyond anything she had consciously processed as real. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, just breathing, doing the arithmetic in her head of what she was seeing, and arriving at a number that seemed, on first encounter, like a mistake. She was not naive about wealth. She had worked in private hospitals, had treated men and women of considerable means, had navigated the particular social textures that came with that. But this was different in kind, not just in degree. And she stood with her hand still on the door frame and looked at those screens and understood, with the quiet finality of someone receiving information that cannot be unfamiliar once it is known, that the man she had been calling Mr. Blackwood and arguing with about his medication schedule was not merely a wealthy man who had suffered a medical setback. He was something of a different order entirely. Then she backed out, closed the door, and went to find Ethan. He was in the library, reviewing documents with his chief of staff, a thin, perpetually worried-looking man named Gerald, who treated Hannah with the polite suspicion of someone who had seen too many nurses come and go to invest emotionally in this one. "I found a room," Hannah said. "Full of screens." Gerald went pale. Ethan looked up from his documents. His expression was unreadable, which was, she had come to understand, itself a kind of expression. "That would be the operations center," he said. "You shouldn't have opened that door." "It wasn't labeled," she said. "Most things aren't." He looked at her for a long moment. "You know what you saw." "I know what I saw," she agreed. "And I'm still here because you need your afternoon medication in 20 minutes. So." She left. Ethan stared at the doorway where she had been standing. Gerald said, very quietly, "Sir?" Ethan said nothing for a moment. Then, with the particular quality of expression that Gerald had seen precisely once before in 11 years of working for him at the birth of his daughter, years ago, in a life that now felt like it had happened to a different man, Ethan Blackwood smiled. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. But Gerald, who was not a man given to dramatics, went home that evening and told his wife that something had changed. She had not changed her manner toward him at all. That was what struck everyone in the household. His personal assistant, his security chief, Mrs. Marsh, Dr. Blank, his Revenue for the Marcis, Voss, they had all expected the discovery of his identity to produce some recalibration in Hannah, some subtle shift in deference or strategy, the way it always did with people who discovered who he was. Instead, she arrived the next morning with mud on her sneakers from the garden, set a single orange marigold in a glass on his windowsill without explanation, and told him it was time for his exercises. "You know who I am," he said. "I know who you are," she confirmed. "You're the man who needs to do 40 minutes of rehabilitation work before lunch. Arms out." He stared at her. "I own hospitals," he said. "Good," she said. "Then you know better than anyone how important physical therapy is. Arms out, Mr. Blackwood." Something that might have been a laugh, a real one, involuntary, surprised out of him, moved through his chest and was gone before it could fully form. But it had been there. His staff noticed. Everyone noticed. The household, which had operated for 2 years at the pitch of constant low-level tension, as though the whole building had been holding its breath, seemed to release some small fraction of that held breath and breathe again. She started taking him outside in the second week of November, when the weather turned sharp and bright and the garden still held its shape beneath the cold. She got him out of the chair and into the special walker frame that Dr. Voss's team had recommended, and she walked beside him through the garden paths, the ones the groundskeepers kept clear and smooth, the ones that wound past the dormant rose beds and the stone fountain and the tall hedge that separated the formal garden from the open lawn. The first time, they made it perhaps 30 feet before he had to stop. He gripped the walker frame and looked at the ground and breathed in the cold air. She stood beside him and said nothing. She had learned, quickly, that he did not want to be encouraged in the ordinary way, did not want to be told that he was doing well, or that he should be proud of himself, or that things were going to get better. What he wanted, she had decided, was simply to be accompanied, to have someone stand beside him in the difficult moments without making the difficulty worse by narrating it. So she stood beside him. She looked at the hedge, which had been pruned into a clean geometric line. "There's a cardinal," she said, after a while, and there was a brief red flash in the bare branches of the dogwood tree at the path's edge. There and gone. Ethan followed her gaze. He said nothing, but his breathing steadied. They went farther each time, 15 feet more on the second day, then another 10, then a day when he pushed past his fatigue and made it all the way to the fountain and stood holding the walker frame in both hands with his eyes closed, and the sound of the water was the only sound, and Hannah sat on the edge of the fountain and said nothing and waited, and the garden held them in its cold bare November patience, and it was enough. Some afternoons the physical therapist from Dr. Voss's team was also there, observing, making notes, occasionally intervening with a technical adjustment. But mostly, those sessions were just the two of them, a billionaire learning to walk again, and a nurse from South Baltimore, who believed in him with a completeness that required no effort and made no noise. His security team, stationed at the garden's perimeter, watched without understanding and reported back to the household that things seemed to be going differently with this one. No one disagreed. He told her about his wife on a Friday afternoon in late November, when the light was failing early and the garden outside the window had gone gray and still. He didn't start with her name. He started, as people often do when talking about the things they've spent the most time not talking about. At an oblique angle, he said that the estate had been different before, that the rooms had held a different quality of sound, that there were things he had gotten used to noticing about a house when someone else was in it that he had only understood he was noticing when they stopped. Hannah sat in the chair across from him and said nothing, just listened with the complete, unhurried attention that she brought to everything. And after a while the words came more directly. Her name had been Claire. She had been an architect. She had grown up in Portland and had never liked New York but had come to love the estate, specifically the garden, which she had redesigned over several years, adding the stone fountain and the cutting beds along the south wall and a pergola near the east hedge that had been taken down after she died because no one had been able to stand looking at it. She had been organized and funny and occasionally maddening in her precision, and she had loved Ethan in the direct, uncomplicated way of someone who had no interest in being impressed by what he had and was only interested in who he was, and he had spent years not fully understanding how rare that was. She had died 18 months ago from an aggressive form of cancer that had been diagnosed late and moved quickly, and Ethan had been with her at the end, and the end had been quiet, and he had sat beside her for a long time after it was over, before he called anyone. He told Hannah this without looking at her, in a voice that was flat and controlled and very careful, the voice of a man who has constructed a container for something enormous and is determined not to let the container break. When he finished, there was a silence. Hannah did not say she was sorry. She did not say Claire sounded like a wonderful woman. She did not say that grief took time or that things would get better. She said, "She planted the roses." It wasn't a question. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "she planted the roses. That's why they're still so well kept." "Yes." Hannah looked out at the garden. "She made something that lasts," she said. "That's not nothing." Ethan looked out at the garden too. The silence between them was different from the silences that had come before. It was not empty, not armored, not the silence of a man keeping people out. It was the silence of two people simply being in the same place together. He found, to his considerable surprise, that he did not want it to end. The trouble began in the third month, quietly at first, then all at once, the way trouble usually does. Two members of Blackwood Capital's board of directors, men who had been maneuvering for years to position themselves for exactly the kind of opportunity that Ethan's incapacitation provided, had begun systematically, cultivating relationships with minority shareholders and proposing amendments to the governance structure that would, if approved, effectively dilute Ethan's controlling interest during periods of what they termed executive incapacity. Gerald had known about the maneuvering for weeks and had not told Ethan, operating on the theory that Ethan had enough to manage and that Gerald could handle the situation himself. This theory turned out to be incorrect. The maneuvering accelerated, and then someone in Gerald would spend months afterward trying to determine who leaked something to the press. The story appeared in a financial publication on a Thursday morning. It suggested, in language carefully calibrated, to imply without quite stating, that Ethan Blackwood's current medical caregiver had been placed in the household through channels connected to the dissident board members, and that her presence served purposes not limited to the medical. The story named Hannah Brooks. It described her background in detail, her modest upbringing, her community college nursing degree, the gap year she had taken to care for her mother during a health crisis, the fact that she had no professional connection to anyone in the Blackwood corporate ecosystem until 3 months ago, framing each of these facts as though they were evidence of something suspicious, rather than simply the history of a woman who had worked hard for everything she had. It included a photograph that someone had taken without her knowledge outside the estate gates, and it ended with a paragraph that managed, in 48 words, to be both entirely unprovable and entirely poisonous. By 10 that morning, the story had traveled to every financial news outlet in the country. By noon, there were 2 news vehicles parked on the public road outside the estate's gates. By 2 in the afternoon, Hannah had read the story on her phone in the small staff room off the kitchen, and she had sat very still for a long time. And then she had gone to find Mrs. Marsh. She told Mrs. Marsh she was going to leave. She was calm about it, practical, logistical. She had her resignation in her head already, the standard courtesy period, the professional handoff, the things she would and would not say to the agency. Mrs. Marsh listened with the expression of a woman who had predicted this moment might come while simultaneously hoping it wouldn't. And then she said, "You should tell him yourself. I don't want to upset him. It will upset him more if you don't." Hannah was quiet for a moment. She stood at the window of the small sitting room adjacent to the kitchen and looked out at the garden, which was bare and brown in the winter light, the fountain switched off, the rose beds dormant under their layer of mulch. She had walked those paths with him. She had stood beside him while he found, in the cold air and the physical effort of 30 feet of progress, something she could not name but recognized the thing that comes back to people when they stop waiting for permission to believe they might recover. She did not want to leave. She had known that for weeks and had been very careful not to examine it too closely. "He doesn't need this on top of everything else," she said. "What he needs," Mrs. Marsh said, with the slight shift in her voice that she permitted herself in moments of genuine feeling, "is precisely the opposite of what you're describing." Hannah went to his study. He was at his desk, reviewing documents, always working, because work was the thing he could control when everything else had slipped out of reach, and he looked up when she came in, and he must have read something in her face, because he set down the papers immediately. She told him about the story. She told him she thought it was better for everyone if she left. She said it clearly and without drama, and she meant every word of it. She was halfway through her third sentence when Ethan said, "Stop." She stopped. He moved then, and it was the most significant physical movement she had seen from him in 3 months. More significant than the exercises and the garden walks and the careful steps in the walker frame, because it was entirely unmedical, entirely unrehearsed, entirely driven by something that had nothing to do with rehabilitation. He pushed himself up from the desk, using his arms, using the careful, slow strength they had been building together for weeks, and he stood shakily, with effort, gripping the desk edge, and he looked at her across the room and he said, very simply, "Don't go." The story died within a week. Ethan's legal team moved with the quiet, thorough efficiency of people who have access to both unlimited resources and a great deal of information, and the publication ran a correction so complete that several industry observers noted it was the most comprehensive editorial retraction they had seen in years. The board members who had been maneuvering against him found themselves facing questions about certain transactions that they had not anticipated being asked about. And the maneuvering stopped. Gerald, who had attempted to manage things without telling Ethan and had failed, submitted his resignation, which Ethan declined, and then submitted a detailed written apology, which Ethan accepted with the brevity of a man who has already moved on. The news vehicles disappeared from the gate. The household returned to something that functioned like quiet. Hannah stayed. She said nothing dramatic about staying. She showed up the next morning with mud on her sneakers, a different pair this time, because the old ones had finally given out, and she told Ethan it was time for his morning exercises, and he said that they were going to do them in the garden today, and she said that was fine. And they went outside together into the cold December light. He worked. That was the only word for what he did in the months that followed. He worked at his recovery the way he had once worked at building the company, with complete, focused, sometimes frightening intensity, setting daily targets and meeting them and then revising them upward, logging every session, reviewing his progress with Dr. Voss weekly, refusing to accept comfortable plateaus. He worked with Hannah every morning and every afternoon, and sometimes in the evenings too, in the long corridor of the East Wing, where the smooth floors made it possible for him to practice walking with the lightest possible support, first the walker frame, then the cane, then certain evenings, nothing at all, just his own 2 feet on the floor, and Hannah walking beside him with her arms ready but not quite touching, not interfering, just present. He fell 3 times. The first time he was furious. The second time he was quieter about it. The third time Hannah helped him up and he stood and took a breath and said, "Again," and they went again. His board of directors received a memorandum in early January, signed by Ethan Blackwood, informing them that he would be attending the February board meeting in person. Several of them, Gerald reported afterward, had read the memorandum multiple times, as though repetition might change its contents. He appeared at the board meeting on a Tuesday afternoon in February. He came in through the main entrance of the Blackwood Capital offices in Midtown Manhattan, and he walked slowly, carefully, with a polished mahogany cane that had belonged to his grandfather, through the lobby and into the elevator, and down the long carpeted corridor to the boardroom, and the people he passed in that corridor stopped and stared and did not know what to say, and Ethan Blackwood said nothing to them, just kept walking with the particular focus of a man who has decided that the act of walking from one end of a corridor to another is, for the moment, the most important thing in the world. He entered the boardroom. He stood at the head of the table. He did not sit down immediately. He let the room absorb what it was, seeing the man who was supposed to be diminished, confined, incapacitated, standing here in a charcoal suit with a mahogany cane and an expression that had been described, by people who had known him for decades, as the same expression he wore when he had already decided something and was giving the other party the courtesy of discovering it themselves. Around the table, 22 people rearranged their assumptions in real time. The 2 dissident directors sat at the far end, and both of them, when Ethan's gaze reached them, found reasons to look at their briefing materials. And then he sat down, set his cane against the table, opened his briefing folder, and began. He spoke for 40 minutes. He spoke about the governance amendments that had been proposed in his absence, and why each of them was going to be withdrawn. He spoke about the nature of the relationships certain board members had developed with minority shareholders during the preceding months, and what those relationships signified and what they would cost. He spoke about the future direction of the company, with a clarity and specificity that left no room for the comfortable ambiguities that the dissidents had been relying on. He spoke with the precision and authority of a man who had not been diminished by what had happened to him, but who had been, in some way that was hard to name, clarified by it, the irrelevant things stripped away, the essential things more visible. When he was finished, the boardroom was very quiet. One of the two dissident directors resigned effective immediately. The other asked to speak with Ethan privately. And that conversation, while brief, was understood by everyone who had any knowledge of it to have been unambiguous in its conclusions. He had kept a journal. Hannah hadn't known about it until the afternoon. In late March, when the first real warmth of the coming spring was in the air, and the rose beds along the south wall were showing the earliest green, that he handed it to her. It was an ordinary journal, dark blue cover, nothing written on the outside, and she held it without opening it, looking at him. "Read it," he said. She sat down in the garden chair, the one they had carried outside on the first day they'd made it all the way to the stone fountain and back. And she opened the journal and read. He had written in it every day since the second week she'd arrived. The handwriting was the same as everything else about him, controlled, precise, slightly angular, the handwriting of a man who had decided that even private things should be done with discipline. The early entries were clinical, notes on pain levels, on sleep, on the incremental exercises she had introduced. Numbers. Measurements. The language of a man who had decided to treat his own recovery as a business project and document it accordingly. But around the third week, something in the entries shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but perceptibly. The way a season changes not on a single day, but in the accumulation of mornings. The language became less clinical and more present tense. He started writing down things she said. There were entries about the exercises, about the pain, about the incremental, almost imperceptible changes in what his body could and couldn't do. There were entries about conversations, small things she had said that he had written down, exactly her comment about the roses, the thing about the cardinal, a joke she had made about his cane that had surprised them both with its appropriateness. There was an entry for the day he'd stood at the board meeting, 3 sentences, precise and plain, that said, walked in, stood at the head of the table. He thought of Hannah. There was an entry dated the day she had tried to resign, which she read twice, and then had to stop for a moment before continuing. And at the end of the most recent entry, written in his handwriting that was precise and slightly angular and more human than she had expected, was a sentence. "She did not save my legs. She saved my life." Hannah looked up. He was watching her with the expression she had come to know best on him, not the closed, armored look, not the careful professional neutrality, but the look underneath those looks, the one that was simply, quietly, entirely himself. She felt the tightness move through her chest and lodge somewhere behind her sternum. And she breathed past it. And then she couldn't. And she didn't try. And the tears came quietly. And she let them. They went to the garden, the same garden where they had walked through the cold months, where she had pointed out the cardinal, and he had told her about Claire, and they had stood in the particular shared silence that was not empty. It was warm now, or warm enough, and the dogwood was in early blossom, and the fountain was running again after the winter, the sound of it light and continuous in the mild afternoon air. The roses along the south wall were beginning to show leaves. Claire's roses, still tended, still returning each year, with the implacable faith of growing things. He hadn't prepared anything. She knew, somehow, that this was not accidental, that the absence of preparation was itself a kind of statement from a man who had spent 2 years building elaborate preparations for everything, controlling every variable, planning every contingency. He had not brought flowers. He had not brought a ring. He stood beside the fountain in his shirt sleeves. Without the cane he no longer needed most days. And he looked at her with the look she knew now, the look that was not armor and not performance, and not the careful management of impression, but simply him, simply the thing underneath everything else, looking at her. And what he said was, "I used to think I had everything." He was quiet for a moment. "I had more than anyone needs, more than most people can imagine. And I built walls around all of it, because I thought walls were how you protected things." Hannah waited. She had gotten good at waiting for him. She had learned, over the months, that the most important things he said always needed a little room before they arrived. He looked at her with the steady, uncomplicated attention that she had once read as coldness and now understood was simply the way he looked at the things that mattered to him. "You walked through every wall I had," he said. "You didn't even knock." She laughed, really laughed. The kind that takes over the body, and he smiled at the sound of it. The way she had noticed he always smiled at the sound of it, as though the laugh itself was doing something to him that he had stopped trying to resist. He reached out and took her hand. Not the careful assisted grip of rehabilitation work, not the structured touch of medical practice, just his hand. Finding hers, simply and directly, the way things happen when someone has finally stopped overthinking them. She looked at their hands. She looked at him. "You're still a pain in the neck," she said. "Absolutely," he said. And then, because he was a man who had learned slowly, painfully, incompletely but truly, that some things are better done than described, he stepped forward and put his arms around her, and the garden held them in its late afternoon light. And the fountain ran, and the first blooms on the dogwood moved in the slight warm breeze, and none of it needed any words at all. 1 year later, a reporter from a major business publication arrived at the headquarters of the Blackwood Foundation in Lower Manhattan to interview its chairman about what the financial press had taken to calling the most significant philanthropic restructuring in the organization's history. Ethan met her in the conference room on the 4th floor without a cane, without a walker, moving through the room with the ease of a man who has earned every step he takes and knows it. The foundation, he explained, had redirected a substantial portion of its annual disbursement toward 3 new programmatic areas: a free training initiative for aspiring nurses and rehabilitation specialists from low-income backgrounds, a network of outpatient recovery centers in underserved communities across 6 states, and a research fund focused on neurological recovery that was already, in its first year of operation, producing results that had attracted the attention of several major academic medical centers. The executive director of the Patient Recovery Fund was Hannah Brooks, who appeared partway through the interview from a meeting down the hall, still in her work clothes, still carrying the spiral notebook she had never stopped using, and who sat beside him with the comfortable ease of someone entirely at home in her own life. The reporter, who had done her research, asked the question that was on everyone's mind: what had changed? Ethan was quiet for a moment. He looked out the window at the city, then at Hannah beside him, and when he looked back at the reporter, there was something in his expression that was not the careful public mask she had expected, but something real and considered and earned. "I believed for a long time that control was what kept things together," he said. "Rules, structure, distance. I thought if you were disciplined enough, you could protect yourself from the things that might undo you." He paused, and then a nurse walked into my house and broke every rule I had inside of 3 hours. And she did it with such complete cheerfulness that I couldn't even be properly angry about it. The reporter smiled. And she was right about everything," Ethan said. As it turns out, Hannah, beside him, made a small sound that might have been agreement, and might have been something else, and Ethan looked at her for a moment with the expression that those who worked closely with them had come to recognize the expression of a man who cannot quite believe his own luck, and who has decided, very deliberately, to believe it anyway. The ceremony to open the first outpatient rehabilitation center, the one in the Bronx, 3 miles from the public hospital, where Hannah had done her earliest clinical work, took place on a Saturday morning in early autumn, when the weather was bright and a little sharp and the leaves had just begun to turn. There were speeches, and a ribbon, and a photograph that ended up in several publications, and afterward there was a lunch for the foundation staff and the medical partners and the community members who had been part of the planning process. And it was a good afternoon, the kind that feels complete in itself. The center was modest by Blackwood Foundation standards: 12 treatment rooms, a therapy gym, a small garden modeled on the one at the estate, a staff of 32, but the people who had spent the planning year on it knew what it represented, which was less about the building than about what the building was for. The idea that recovery is not a privilege available only to people who can pay for it, that the same care, the same patience, the same refusal to give up on a body's capacity to heal itself could be made available to anyone who needed it. The program would train 20 new nurses and physical therapists per year. recruited specifically from low-income backgrounds, provided with full scholarships and living stipends and mentorship from some of the best rehabilitation physicians in the country. The first cohort had already been selected. Hannah had read each of their applications herself, but the part that stayed with everyone who was there, the part that people mentioned, quietly, when they talked about it later, was a moment that wasn't planned. Near the end of the afternoon, when the formal events were over and people were beginning to gather their things and say their goodbyes, someone looked out the window of the community room and saw two people walking in the small garden behind the building. A big man moving with a slight deliberateness that spoke of work and discipline and recovered ground, and a shorter woman in blue, walking beside him, their voices inaudible through the glass, their posture easy and close. The garden was a modest thing, a path, a few benches, some late-season flowers in raised beds along the wall, nothing like the estate garden in the hills north of the city. With its stone fountain, and its carefully tended roses, and its 40 acres of quiet. But they walked through it the same way they walked through that garden, not like a billionaire and a nurse, not like a patient and a caregiver, not like an employer and an employee, not like any of the categories that the world wanted to arrange them into. Just two people, walking, together, in a small garden that smelled of autumn and something growing, where the afternoon light came in low and warm, and cast their shadows long across the path, and the day held them gently, and asked nothing more of them than this.